The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, 5 federal leaders will square off in the only English language debate of this general election. It's potentially a huge moment in the campaign. Do they know what voters want to hear? That's where we'll start tonight. What's seizing the electorate, and how much of this is a wedge issue election? Then we'll take the temperature of what has or has not been playing in that other huge electoral prize, besides Ontario, our neighbors in Quebec. It's Thursday, September 9th, and that's all next on The Agenda. Every election, voters have an opportunity to make a statement, to affirm a past choice, to kick the bums out, to respond to party brands and values, to take a side on wedge issues. As the campaign hits high gear for these final days of the 44th general election, what can we see so far about what's motivating voters? Let's canvass some seasoned observers by welcoming in Denham, Quebec, David Hurley, principal partner at the Gandalf Group, host of the Hurley Burley podcast, and now the election cycle spin-off podcast, Curse of Politics, the Hurley Burley political panel. In London, Ontario, Laura Stevenson, Associate Professor of Political Science at Western University. And in the provincial capital, Peter Loewen, Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto and the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And welcome to Robin Urbach, columnist for the Globe and Mail, and it's great to have you four here. And I want to start, David, with you, because I do make it a point to listen to your Curse of Politics every day. It's just terrific. And I heard you offer advice to the Liberal leader in advance of tonight's all-important English language debate by saying he's got to look like a leader and he's got to do it with humility. How do you do that?
Well, I think that you have to have a real sense of earning this rather than being entitled to it. And I know that Mr. Trudeau doesn't have a lot of respect, I don't think, really for the Conservatives and for some of the people he's running against. And so it's hard for him not to show that. It's hard for him not to show that he thinks he's entitled to this victory. And I think that there's enough votes out there for him to win. But I also think that there's a desire, especially since the election was seen to be largely motivated by his own interests rather than the public interest. I think there's a desire to take him down a peg at the same time. And so that's the narrow path he needs to navigate and walk, is getting people's votes by demonstrating why they want to vote for him, but not looking like he's going to emerge as a big winner as a consequence. All
right, Robin, let me follow up with you on that. Do you think, and that clearly was a big narrative at the beginning of this campaign, why are we having this early, unnecessary, in the middle of a fourth wave election? Do you think the Liberal leader has managed to shake off that sense that many in the electorate had?
I don't think so, frankly. I mean, it's come up right from the get-go in the 2 French language debates that we've seen thus far, and I think it's going to be one of the first questions out of the gate, either from one of the moderators or from the other leaders vying for the top job in the debate tonight. I think the problem that Trudeau has had shaking that question is really threefold. One is that he hasn't really offered a satisfactory answer. We know, obviously, it was because the Liberals wanted a majority. The polling looked incredibly, favorable for them at the beginning, but we like pretense in this country, and we haven't gotten that pretense yet. I think number 2 is the polling just shows that people don't see that this election really was necessary. I think it was Nanos had a poll probably about a week ago that showed 3 out of 4 respondents didn't think the election was necessary. And the third thing, it's a little bit more anecdotal, but I've been hearing from people in the 3 major parties that this is something that they're hearing at the doors. So people are knocking on doors for the NDP, for the Liberals, for the Conservatives, and what they're hearing is people are saying, I don't know why we're having an election. And to have that come up at the door now, when we are maybe a week away, a little over a week away from Election Day, that's a real problem for the Liberals. And if they can't quash it tonight, I don't think they're going to quash it at all.
Okay, but Laura, I think I've heard Jenny Byrne say this on David's podcast, that Canadians never want elections, which is an odd thing when you live in a democracy. They certainly don't want early elections. But when they have them, they're sort of forced to make a choice. In your judgment, have we yet heard a good reason that would satisfy the public as to why the Prime Minister decided to go early?
I don't think he's given a really good reason for that just yet. In fact, I would say that that's probably the hardest part about thinking about what's this election actually about, because I'm not sure that voters are clear. What are they actually deciding between? Like, what are these big issues they're trying to get at? I think Trudeau does have a job ahead of him to try and define that even more tonight. I think they're trying, but, you know, lots of other stuff is getting in the way, right? Certainly the kind of protests and the violence that we've been seeing at some stops, you know, trying to deal with the fourth wave. It's hard for him to get down to the issues. And I think he wants to define the Liberals separate from the other parties, but I'm not sure he's been doing a good job so far. Peter,
have you yet heard an explanation for what this election is all about that satisfies you?
Well, I think the Prime Minister in the early days said that the election was about trying to get a mandate to deal with COVID in the next stages of it. And I think when he went further with that, what he was arguing was that what he needed was a mandate for vaccine passports, that he needed, you know, the public support to make people show that they're vaccinated when they get on a plane or an airplane. I think the difficulty with that explanation politically is that the Prime Minister has had the run of Parliament for the last 2 years, last 18 months. There's never been a time where there's been this degree of cooperation in our Parliament outside of wartime. And the Prime Minister has had incredible latitude to do what he wants in Parliament. So the chink in the armor is that during this debate, when the Prime Minister comes up and says, if you re-elect us, here's the thing we can do: hiring more doctors, not having federal sick leave, bringing a vaccine passport. Mr. Singh and Mr. O'Toole could simply say, you could have done that, and it could be in place now if you hadn't have called this election. But you've prioritized the election over those policies. So I think we know how little you actually care about them. That's really the difficulty here, that, you know, in past years when minority governments have ended early, it's often been because there has been genuine gridlock within Parliament. That was not the case here. But it's really on Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Singh at this point to articulate that to voters and to really, I think, make concrete in their head what would have been different had the Prime Minister not called this election. So I think he hasn't given a good answer, but I also don't think that they've prosecuted a very good case about what we're missing because of the early election.
Well, David, I've gone back and looked at many of the last so-called early election calls that were made before they really needed to be made. And much more often than not, you get away with it. Much more often than not, the Prime Minister or the Premier that calls it early ends up renewing their mandate. Sometimes, as in Premier Horgan of British Columbia, you started with a minority and you got a majority. The voters will give it to you if they think they've heard a reasonable explanation for why you're going. Have they heard that reasonable explanation yet, in your view?
No, I don't think so. And it's probably too late to provide it by stepping up to the microphone and saying, here's what the election is about. I mean, I think if you had had your druthers, you would have had a much clearer argumentation out of the gate about what it was for. And the thing that was clearly missing, to go to Peter's point, the thing that was clearly missing was, what is it that they wanted to do that the NDP wouldn't let them do? And so without that, it's pretty difficult to make an argument that you needed an election to pursue that particular mandate. However, I don't think that at the end of the day, people are going to vote on the basis of an early election. What this early election call did, I've been doing a weekly focus group with swing voters from Ontario and BC. And when I met with them the Saturday before the call, they all knew the election was going to be called, and they all knew why, because Mr. Trudeau wanted a majority. So that was months of preconditioning about the election call had penetrated that, and people really understood that. And therefore, there was a very heavy burden on Mr. Trudeau to persuade people that there was a public interest to the election as opposed to just a partisan interest to the election. And I don't think he's shaken that. And what that did is it made people revisit his character. And is he more cynical than he used to be? Or is he more manipulative than they thought he was? And is he a little less public spirited than the pandemic made him appear to be? All those character questions came into play. And I think in the early stages of the campaign, they worked particularly well in contrast with Mr. Singh. But I think that factor is fading a bit as well. I think ultimately on election day, the early election, people will not be voting on the basis of the call. They may be voting on the basis of what the call told them about Mr. Trudeau. That's a different matter.
Well, let's do a little comparing and contrasting between the three main party leaders and even the fourth, if you want to add the Greens' Annamie Paul into this. And Laura, I'll go to you first on this. You know, I was interested to read John Ibbitson the other day saying that the Conservative leader currently is the most liberal Conservative leader that he's seen in the last many decades. And of course, many people are making the argument that the Liberals and the New Democrats aren't that different, and neither, frankly, are the Greens. You could make the argument that ideologically, these four major parties are all closer together, not the same, but closer together than at many other times in our history. If that's the case, Laura, what do you think that says about the nature of our political culture today?
So I would agree with that that characterization of what's going on, and I think we've seen it most clearly with the Conservatives this time around, because in the past, I think the distinctions were a lot clearer, and we've seen a couple of statements come out from Mr. O'Toole that in particular make me think that he's trying to do this a little bit differently. So his position on guns, for example, as well as very clearly on his own stance on abortion, I think that those are setting him apart from previous leaders. And then when that happens, it does appear that we're squishing in the middle, for the center, I guess, of the political spectrum. So in that case, what are we thinking of? We've got to think about who are the pair of hands that people are going to be wanting to trust to move forward. And that's why I'm finding it harder to think about what's actually going through people's minds right now. What are they actually measuring?
Peter, do you find that as well, that the parties seem to be more bunched wherever the middle is? They're more there and closer to it than in previous elections?
I think so. I mean, I want to note that our Conservative Party is a pretty liberal Conservative Party in the grand scheme of things, and it was under Mr. Harper as well. But what you have right now is unusually you have a single issue that is seizing the country still, the pandemic. So often elections are about what issue one party wants to fight on versus what issue another party wants to fight on. But for the most part, this election is about the pandemic and the recovery from it. Parties have different answers about that challenge, but for the most part, they agree on what the challenge is. I think what that does then is that it really primes leadership, because voters look at that and they say, well, all these guys want to recover from the pandemic. Which leader do I think is going to be best to do that? And I'll just underscore that I really agree with David's assessment here that what this is about is how things like the election call, how things like the debates, and how things like people's views on handling of the recovery, how those things translate into evaluations of the leaders. And at the end of the day, what matters more than anything else is people's views of which leader is going to be strongest, going to be best, most going to appreciate their own concerns when they go into the ballot box. So looking at things through that lens, as David has, I think is very fruitful for understanding, why Mr. O'Toole, for example, is really trying to soften himself vis-a-vis, previous Conservative leaders.
Well, that leads me to, I think it was on Sesame Street where they once had the line, one of these things is not like the others, and that would be the People's Party. They are definitely not in the mainstream, and happily so. And Robin, let me get you in on that. We have seen some polling in the last few days which suggests that the People's Party, Maxime Bernier's party, has really shot up in Ontario. I think at 11, they're at 11% in Ontario, and similarly with favorable numbers in the province of Quebec. How do you read that?
I think it's something that we ignore at our peril, and I speak to the electorate and political leaders and the whole establishment. I think there's an inclination to kind of look at, for example, some of the rallies that have been trailing the Liberal leader across the country and just sort of cast them off as a bunch of whack jobs who just hate masks and they don't want their vaccines. But these numbers are really tough to ignore. And I think what's particularly interesting is if you look at the polling and you look at where some of the support is coming from, sure, there's probably a little bit that's coming from the right end of the Conservative base, perhaps people who are feeling a bit alienated as Erin O'Toole moves closer to the center. But what seems to be happening more profoundly is the People's Party and Maxime Bernier is energizing a base that wasn't previously inclined to engage in the electoral system. And that's really interesting to see. And I think we need to ask ourselves, what is it about this party that's appealing to these people in the same way, frankly, that Donald Trump engaged a section of the electorate that wasn't really engaged previously. Another aspect that's interesting too is if you look at the trajectory of the rise of PPC support, it seems to have really taken off probably mid-August or so. And what was happening then was we were having all these talks about vaccine mandates. So Manitoba was coming out with a plan, Quebec was coming out with a plan. It was still the federal government at that point. The federal government was saying if you work in the federal public service or you want to take a domestic flight or go on a train within Canada, you're going to have to be vaccinated. And what we saw is that support for the PPC rose a lot during that time. So I think we'll have to see whether the support that the party is enjoying now is transient or whether it's something that could stick around beyond this pandemic. I mean, there's aspects of the PPC platform, as much as we might want to cast it off, that really could appeal to anti-establishment types, people who, for example, don't support supply management in this country, which is a reasonable position to take, people who don't support interprovincial trade barriers, which is another reasonable position to take. Maxime Bernier has promised to balance the budget should he become prime minister in his first mandate, which, I mean, we're talking hypothetical here, but these are the sorts of things that could appeal to voters beyond just people who vehemently reject vaccine mandates and don't like what's happening with the federal government at this point. This is something that could have some longevity. So it's something certainly I think we need to pay attention to throughout this election and definitely beyond.
David, do your conversations with the people that you have in your focus groups give you any added insight as to why the People's Party in the last few days in particular have started to really go up in popularity?
No, they haven't, and I'll discuss that with them more this weekend. It really hasn't come up much so far, but I'm very much where I think Robin is, that there may be a small part of this growth that is a result of, we can't forget that Aaron O'Toole's done a hard virage to the center from his leadership campaign. And there are undoubtedly some Leslyn Lewis and Derek Sloan supporters who don't see themselves reflected in this conservative party that he's putting forward, and therefore maybe have navigated to the People's Party. But when the People's Party was talking about supply management, it was at 1.7% of the vote. And now that it's talking about the tyranny of vaccine mandates and the need for revolution, it's at 11% in the polls in Ontario. So that's really what is galvanizing it. It's really an outsider, anti-establishment, and all of that culminates in vaccine mandates, lockdowns, and restrictions on personal freedom that, are, I think, tied up culturally. These people, I think, would similarly be reacting very badly to Mr. Trudeau and the general political system's political correctness and the kinds of social changes about what you can say and can believe and can't believe anymore. And I think that's a similar type of phenomenon with the vaccine, mask, and lockdown mandates. And so these are the people that are alienated by the direction that Canadian society is going, would be my take.
Peter, can we say that they are sort of the 21st century incarnation of the old Reform Party?
Well, I think there's a lot of insight there. So I'll just say two things about it. I mean, if you map PPC support onto where the Reform Party did well in Ontario, or where the old Confederation of Regions Party did well in New Brunswick, for example, you start to see that some of it is there. I share David's intuitions that this is about larger cultural forces. And what I think people need to understand is that COVID has not been experienced equally across the country, but lockdowns have been, and vaccine mandates will be, and mask mandates have been. So if you live in North Bay, if you live in Sudbury, for the most part of the pandemic, you did not experience any COVID cases for a lot of that time. And yet people were asked to make some pretty substantial sacrifices during provincial lockdowns. COVID was isolated in cities, principally. There would be flare-ups, right? But what we have to realize is that people's risk-reward kind of ratio around COVID has been really different depending on where you live. And I think that there's a real large percentage of voters who are just kind of tired of being told that they have to make more sacrifices in their life. Yeah, you map that onto this other stuff, like they can't say stuff, they can't believe stuff, and that matters as well. But I think that there is just some real fatigue with COVID around this. And for the Prime Minister to suggest that people who don't want to don't want to be vaccinated or don't want to support mask mandates or something like that are somehow lesser than other Canadians. You might think that. Other people might think that, but no one likes to hear that if they're on that side of that. So, there is some basis to this anger, whether it's right or not.
Laura, if and or when people tune into the leaders' debate later this evening, they will not find Maxime Bernier on the debate stage. He didn't meet the criteria set out by the Debate Commission earlier in the campaign by the deadline. He certainly has met some of the criteria now. His polling numbers are much higher now than they were then. My question for you is, would you have preferred to see him on the debate stage so that Canadians could see him good, bad, or indifferent?
It's a really good question, because at the beginning of the campaign, I didn't think we'd be here, right? I didn't think we'd be at this point. And I certainly agree with all the other panelists about kind of what's driving the support for the PPC right now. And, at this point, I would say, yes, it would be great to have, a more fulsome discussion with Bernier on the stage so that people could see what is he standing for exactly, and, what is coming out. And because I guess I'm a little hesitant to think that the support we're seeing in the polls for the PPC necessarily will translate into votes. I'm not sure how stable it is or how much more of just an angry statement it is. But I think the point's already been made that the PPC does have a platform, right? They do have ideas. And so it would be useful, I think, to be able to compare what Bernier says to what others say. But, the ship has sailed, so to speak, just because I don't think a lot of us predicted we'd be here today.
Mm-hmm. Well, all right, here's what they are going to talk about at the leaders' debate later tonight. The 5 issues that they've told the leaders to prep up on are issues around affordability, climate change, COVID recovery, leadership and accountability, and reconciliation. And, okay, Robin, let me start with you on this, because I guess during the course of your columnizing for the Globe and Mail, you get a lot of feedback from your readers, and you have a sense about what they care about and are interested in. Do these 5 general buckets cover what you think Canadians are interested in tonight?
I think so. I mean, they're broad enough. Leadership and accountability, what does that mean? That could be anything. We could be talking about ethical scandals. We could be talking about leadership on foreign policy, leadership on healthcare, which sort of folds into other things. I think for the most part, what I hear from readers, and I think what these parties are hearing from people that they're talking to at the door, is it's the same issues that people care about in every election, really, which is, how am I going to take care of my kids? How can moms go back to work and still afford childcare? With an added twist, of course, this time about the pandemic. What are we doing for healthcare? There's a newfound appreciation, deservedly so, for allocating necessary resources to sectors like long-term care and beefing up our healthcare system to the extent that that's within federal jurisdiction. The interesting twist this election, too, is how foreign policy factors into all of it. Foreign policy generally isn't one of those things that moves votes one way or the other, but I don't think any of us could ignore that the day that the Prime Minister went to the Governor General to ask to dissolve Parliament was the same day that Kabul fell to the Taliban. So what we had was this really bizarre situation where we had horrific images of people grasping planes at the Kabul airport, and then the Liberal leader in Ottawa in the suit talking about how this is the most consequential election since 1945. I don't know that Afghanistan and the issue around getting our interpreters and our allies out of there has stuck around to the extent that probably the Conservatives would have wanted to. I don't think it's top of mind the way it was a couple of weeks ago, but I think it's still a relevant consideration. Same with the 2 Michaels that have been detained in China for over 1,000 days now. This is something that's permeated the public consciousness, I think, more than foreign policy issues tend to. So I think, for us political nerds, we probably would have loved to see that included in the debate as well. Maybe it will come up a little bit, but I think for the most part, the topics that will be discussed tonight are pretty much what are top of mind for Canadians across the country.
Well, let me follow up on the China angle with David Hurley, and that is that it's funny, I got an email from somebody earlier today saying Erin O'Toole rarely but occasionally brings up the issue of quote-unquote communist China. And he's clearly trying to put a bit of a wedge between where he feels we ought to be on China versus where the current prime minister is on China. And our relations with China have perhaps never been worse than they are right now for a whole bunch of reasons that we all know of. Robin just enumerated some of them. Why has China not been a bigger factor in this election campaign, and in particular, urged on by the Conservatives, who you would think could make some hay with it?
I don't think anybody's interested in it. And I would just take issue with Robin. I had a focus group a couple of weeks ago. We talked about Afghanistan. People were aware of what was happening. They weren't nearly as concerned about the people left behind as the media coverage would have suggested, and they didn't see any partisan angle to it whatsoever. And they thought that that was something that the government of Canada did, not something that a Liberal government did or a Conservative government did. So it was just not relevant to the election campaign. And I don't think the issue with China has really penetrated the public consciousness either, although I think, it will be a big deal in the Chinese community in Canada, among Chinese voters. This election, Peter said it right, it's about COVID. But if it isn't about COVID, it's about the economy. And the first section on affordability in the economy, that's the section. If somebody comes out of this debate, either O'Toole or Trudeau, having convinced most people that they are again, to borrow a term somebody used, safe hands to handle the economy, and second of all, has some empathy for what the ordinary person is going through in terms of their own financial pressures and affordability, that person will win the election.
My memory isn't as good as it used to be, but so I'm going to fact check you on this right now. Didn't you give safe hands as a slogan for Kathleen Wynne? Is that where I heard it first?
2014.
Okay.
2014. And when the other guy promises to cut 100,000 jobs, it really works well.
Right.
It was
right.
safe hands or reckless schemes. I remember that one.
Right on. Okay. So my memory's not as bad as it occasionally is. Okay, Laura, let's move on to this then. It seems impossible to get through an election campaign without one or more parties playing the wedge issue game on one another. And we did see the Liberals come out, they tried to do a wedge on abortion. They're trying to do a wedge issue now on guns. They're, it's been happening. How relevant, how useful do you think that is in terms of helping the electorate make up its mind on where to mark their X?
So this is, I think, the interesting thing about O'Toole's position on guns. I heard recently that there's now a footnote on the online platform to indicate the change in stance. Because I think what voters are looking for is something that they can really distinguish between the parties for, right? So otherwise it comes down to, well, leadership is definitely, as other panelists have said, leadership matters, whether they think they can trust somebody or they think they have empathy. But if there's a specific issue that they can say, I disagree with this compared to I agree with this, then that really helps them to make the big distinctions. And so, I mean, the Liberals have been trying. I'm not sure it's sticking, I have to be honest. It doesn't seem to me that there's a lot of clear distinctions that are happening this time around. And so it will be interesting to see what happens in the debate tonight, because I think this is an opportunity where the leaders can try to call each other out even more specifically and see if any of those kinds of ideas get more traction. Well,
let's see if this has some sticking value to it. And I know Erin Kelly, the pollster, was on our program a few nights ago, and she said every time there's one of these ultra-violent, well, I guess by Canadian standards, demonstrations where people pick up gravel and throw it at the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau's polling numbers get a boost. And Peter, I wonder from you if you think that unanticipated, this whole I'm the champion of democracy against this angry mob that wants to rip the country apart and deny science, has this issue given Trudeau a voice that he didn't expect to have 4 weeks ago?
So my intuition is no, actually. And I think in the din of a campaign, campaigns can tell themselves that something is working really well, and in fact it isn't. So if I think about what the argument that's being made here, is it Mr. Trudeau is standing up against these barbarians at the gate, which he on the other hand describes as a small ragtag minority of the population. So what's the threat here? He's talking about the need to deal with this 10% of people who don't want to get vaccinated. Well, they're not a threat to him electorally. They're certainly quite rude, and they're a threat to his rallies, and there probably is some threat of violence there. But this isn't someone standing against mobs at the gates and kind of holding them back against us. The other thing about this is that no one's scared of these folks beyond Mr. Trudeau, and I don't think he's scared of them either, frankly. Right? I mean, it's not that he's protecting us from these folks. So I just think that he can stand up and say he's going to defend journalists. Who cares? He can get up and say he's going to defend the vaccinated healthcare workers. He's not actually making a corridor through to a hospital. So I actually think that this is one where the campaign is telling itself that this is playing really well. But I think all it's doing is just crowding out whatever message they should be trying to deliver about their policy and about why they're having an election today. Remember, if there wasn't an election today, there wouldn't be these protests.
David, do you think they've been a useful foil for Trudeau?
I really want to pick up on what Peter said, because last week in the focus group, we talked about this, and I showed people a clip of Trudeau in Sudbury. And this was a clip that Liberals were excitedly sharing around Twitter. And it was where he really changed his approach from compassion to the protesters to us versus them, and I'm fighting them, and O'Toole should be ashamed to be associated with them, and all that. And I showed that to my focus group of swing voters, and they didn't like it at all. They thought it was highly divisive, inflammatory language for a prime minister to be using. They thought he was overstating the threat for political reasons. And frankly, they thought that his initial posture of let's try to understand these people and at least respect them on some level was far more fitting for a prime minister than the tone that got the partisans all worked up.
Interesting. Laura, what's your take on it?
Yeah, I think I'd agree on that. What is the danger is a really good question. I think we've talked about the PPC and who is being drawn to support that party right now. And I mean, I think we're seeing a lot of anger, right? A lot of frustration. And I would agree with Peter that I think it does come out of the pandemic. And so when we see this kind of bubbling over, it's, for me, it's personally quite worrying. But I think I'm not sure that creating it, as a conservative versus liberal issue is the right way to do it. I mean, I would agree with the focus group people that the first stance, I think, was the right stance. We're going to take the high road on this, and let's talk about Canadians and how we can get everyone better. I mean, that's certainly the leadership stance, right? If you want to be seen as a good leader moving forward, you can't be the leader that's only for some of the people. You have to be the leader that is going to be listening to the voices of all Canadians, including those that have been suffering and are the most kind of, I'll say disgruntled, but not without reason in many cases.
Well, Robin, maybe there's a difference between watching these demonstrations on video and actually being there. Because your colleague from the Toronto Star, Susan Delacourt, was on this program a few days ago in which she said she was there and it was terrifying, and she described what she saw as a democratic mutation and wondered how the people involved in those demonstrations would at all be governable going forward, that there was a fury and an anger that just seemed completely out of control. Do you think this has worked ultimately to the Prime Minister's benefit, in as much as he can now really set himself up as being in significant contradistinction to whatever it is they stand for?
I sort of agree with what David said, actually. I think that the relevance might be overstated within partisan liberal circles. And I think it's a problem that all of the parties tend to experience in the midst of an election within their own war room. They sort of adopt their own ideology and think it applies to the wider population. So the Liberals might think that Justin Trudeau taking a strong stance against a violent enemy reads really well among the public, and they just sort of shrug it off, the same way that in last election, I think the Conservatives had a real problem with assuming that the rest of the population just hated Justin Trudeau the way that the Conservatives did. And because of that, they didn't offer much by way of platform or policy or ideology or outlook. They just kind of villainized Justin Trudeau and hoped that was enough. And of course it wasn't. So I think it may have seemed as though Justin Trudeau had a great foil in these people, particularly at the beginning when the Liberals, I think, were really struggling to find that wedge. As we've mentioned, they went through abortion, that didn't really work. They tried vaccine mandates, that hasn't really worked all that well. They tried two-tiered healthcare, That hasn't worked. Now we're on to guns. It's a real issue, especially when all of these things that they're throwing at Aaron O'Toole, he can kind of call their bluff. So if they call him anti-abortion, he has no problem with coming out and saying, actually, I'm pro-choice. I think that's been a real struggle for the Liberals throughout this election, is finding that wedge that really resonates, finding a target in Aaron O'Toole or even in the people who are trailing the Liberal leader across the country, finding a way to kind of create an adversarial relationship to really distinguish the Liberal leader from that opposition. And I think they haven't quite found it yet.
Well, he's got a chance at the debate tonight, and we'll see if it happens. Enjoy the debate tonight, you four. Thanks to Robin Urbach, Peter Lowen, Laura Stevenson, and David Hurley for joining us on TVO tonight. All good wishes to you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Last night, the federal leaders debated for the second time in French, primarily, of course, for a Quebec audience. La Belle Province is, of course, always critical for federal politics, but for the rest of Canada, the issues, the players, and the motivations of voters are rarely well known. Here to help remedy that just a bit, we welcome in Montreal, Quebec, Danielle Bellon, Director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, and in Kingston, Ontario, Stéphanie Chouinard, who teaches political science at the Royal Military College and Queen's University. And it's good to have both of you on TVO tonight. Let's just start with a very simple question. Stéphanie, who did the best in last night's debate, in your view?
I thought the leader who was able to explain the best his policies was Mr. Trudeau last night. I thought he was remarkable in how in-depth he knew his own policies, especially compared with Mr. O'Toole, who's obviously a little bit less nimble in French, but often came back to, we have a plan for that, and we have a plan for that, and was less so able to explain to the viewers what that plan actually was.
Danielle, your view?
Yes, I agree. And I think if you read the newspapers, the Francophone newspapers in Quebec this morning, this is the general impression, I think, overall, that the Prime Minister did well. And there was this moment, I think, probably the very intense, most intense moment of the debate where the Prime Minister really criticized Yves-François Blanchet's claim that he has the monopoly of, speaking for Quebecers. And this was a very strong moment for Justin Trudeau in the debate. A debate that was, I must say, a bit fragmented and not always that fascinating. But that's, these debates are uneven. In general.
That's a nice way of saying the cast of Ben-Hur was involved in last night's debate. They had, anyway, if you didn't see it, lots of different questioners coming on during the course of things. The 11-year-old kid I thought was pretty good. That was very interesting. But Stéphanie, let me follow up with this. There was that moment where Mr. Trudeau tried to tell Monsieur Blanchet, I'm a Quebecer, and don't you tell me what a Quebecer's all about. I can be a Quebecer and a proud Canadian all at the same time. I'm sure an English audience would love to hear that. How do you think that plays in Quebec itself?
I think in Quebec that was a very strong moment, and I was not so surprised to see Mr. Trudeau come at Mr. Blanchet for this, because one of Mr. Blanchet's lines throughout this election was the Bloc Québécois is really the only way to make sure that Quebec's voices are heard in Parliament. And Mr. Trudeau very rightly pointed that there were 11 members of his cabinet that are actually members of Parliament for Quebec. And so he was trying to make the point that any political party in Parliament can represent Quebecers. There are 78 seats in the House of Commons that are from Quebec, and it is up to Quebecers to decide what color these seats are going to be.
Daniel, some of us are old enough to remember the fact that John Diefenbaker won, I think, 58 seats in Quebec, not being able to speak a word of French beyond bonjour and au revoir. Aaron O'Toole's French is certainly way better than John Diefenbaker's. Is it good enough for a Quebec audience that cares about how well a Conservative leader can speak French?
I think his level of French is adequate. I don't think it's the quality of French that's the problem in and of itself. But I think it's that he doesn't say that much. So he repeats the same talking points over and over again. And I think Yves-François Blanchet laughed at him especially during the TVA face-to-face last week, that he was always repeating that he had a plan, but didn't say that much beyond that. And I think that might be related to the fact that he's not so comfortable debating in French, so he repeats talking points, and that makes him look a bit, I would say, on the neutral side, like not really that involved. And you can say, well, it's prime ministerial to look calm, but sometimes you need a bit of fire in your belly, and you need to show that you're passionate about the issues. And I don't think it was a great debate for Erin O'Toole last night.
You know, it's interesting, Stephanie, of Trudeau, Singh, the Green leader, Annamie Paul, and Erin O'Toole, only one of them is born in Quebec, and it's O'Toole. How's his French? He's born in Montreal, and he likes to remind people during the Quebec debates, I'm happy to be back in the city of my birth. How is his French in your view?
I think Francophone voters are very happy with this election because it's the first time in at least my life that we have all of the leaders of the main federal parties who are fluent in French. And we're not, as Francophones, listening to the French debates and trying to decipher what they're saying, because we actually understand what they're saying. And as Danielle was saying, the problem is that some of them were not saying much. Some of the tones last night were, I think, adequate for a Quebec audience, but we were expecting more. This was the second debate in French. We were looking for a little bit more policy substance, a little bit more fire. Again, like Danielle said, a little bit of passion in this debate, and it only really came up in the second half of the debate, I think. But more so, I think, for Mr. O'Toole, the problem was not the fluency of his French, is that the question for him has changed since the beginning of the campaign. He's not the underdog anymore. As of last week, he was leading. And so people are looking at him and they're asking, does he have the fabric of a prime minister? And last night, he did not show that.
Daniel, let me ask you about another party leader born and raised in the province of Quebec who was not there last night. Maxime Bernier was not invited last night. What do you think the viewers missed by not having the leader of the People's Party there?
Well, I think that it's interesting that Bernier, of course, is. I think the fact that he's not there, I'm not sure that it's necessarily bad for him, because he can then say that I'm excluded by mainstream politics, and he's a populist leader, so saying that the elites are excluding him is actually part of his rhetoric, right? So not being at the table. Then he can say, well, I'm a victim of these, the mainstream media and the elite, and so he can surf on that populist wave. But still, I think that it's important to understand what's happening with the People's Party, that they are ahead of the Green Party right now in the polls. And we'll see if Maxime Bernier can retake his seat in Beauce, for example. If the People's Party can elect just even one MP, they will have a presence in the House of Commons. And I think that could be a game changer for them. And this discourse, populist right-wing discourse that is now closely tied to anti-vax or anti-mask protest, that this discourse has quite a few takers in this country, as we can see looking at polling numbers. So it's important to, I think, not neglect the People's Party, especially because they could hurt the Conservatives. Because if they take votes away from a party, it would be primarily from the Conservatives, perhaps in Quebec a bit from the Bloc, but certainly not from the NDP, the Liberals, or the Green Party on average.
Let me follow up with you, Stephanie, on that, in as much as when the deadline was set, the People's Party was only polling at 2%. They didn't have any seats in the House, and therefore they were rendered ineligible to participate in both last night's debate and tonight's debate. However, now they're at 11% in some polls in Ontario and 11% in at least one poll in Quebec. What influence do you think they can have in this campaign at this juncture?
Yeah, unfortunately for the PPC, the rules were set before the election, and they needed to hit that 4% in the polls 5 days after the election was called, so on August 20th, and so that's why really they were disqualified. But I think to Danielle's point, I think it's true that Mr. O'Toole was probably happy, in fact, that Mr. Bernier was not on the stage last night, because there is a chance that he can split the vote on a number of issues. Not only is the PPC the new home of the anti-mask, anti-vax population. But we also need to remember that Maxime Bernier is a libertarian. And so when we're talking about, for example, the possession of firearms, his position is very clear. And we've seen Erin O'Toole flip-flop on this issue in the past week. The other issue that we're seeing in the polls, though, is that the rise in percentage of the PPC does not only come from people who were going to vote Conservative. It seems like we have a little bit of an undeciding vote base coming to the PPC this time around, or people who may have decided to vote for the PPC who otherwise wouldn't have voted. So we have a bit of a Brexit kind of situation here, where we have new voters that are showing up in the polls that don't appear to be disaffected Conservatives.
Well, let's see how that might affect the state of play. And in doing so, I'm going to ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to bring up a graphic here showing what the seat count was of the Quebec seats in the House of Commons before Parliament was dissolved. The Liberals had the most number of seats in Quebec at 35, Le Bloc Québécois close on their heels at 32. The Conservatives, yes, had 10 seats in the province of Quebec, and the NDP, despite the orange wave of a few elections ago, were down to 1. Now, I guess one of the things that I'm interested in here, Danielle, is that before last night's debate, polls were picking up a bit of a surge to the Conservatives at the expense of the Bloc. And I wouldn't necessarily have thought that the same voter could be attracted to both of those parties. What's the common element between the Conservatives and the Bloc that would allow a voter to say, I'm not as interested in the Bloc, and therefore I may give the Conservatives my vote this time? What's going on?
I think the key issue here is the vision of federalism, a more decentralizing vision. Erin O'Toole mentions François Legault regularly on the campaign trail, and it was certainly the case also in this in the first of the two official debates, so last night. I think that he has courted Quebecers, Quebec nationalists, people who are likely to support François Legault at the provincial level. And so I think that in terms of Francophone voters living outside of Montreal, both the Bloc and the Conservatives are really targeting the same audience, basically. And so that's why Erin O'Toole talks a lot about François Legault, because he's a very popular premier. It's not like Doug Ford or even worse, Jason Kenney, worse in terms of what has happened to them since the beginning of the pandemic, who have failed in the polls. François Legault remains very popular in Quebec, and both the Conservatives and the Bloc are really focusing on CAQ voters, people who vote for CAQ at the provincial level, and who are often nationalists, but they are not necessarily sovereignist, and they want to support a party that will favor a decentralization of the federal system. And that's what both the Conservatives and the Bloc are talking about. Of course, the rhetoric is different, but in the end, I think they have something strong in common in terms of a vision of federalism, where the provinces, for example, on healthcare, will get more money from Ottawa without any strings attached, something that the Liberals and the NDP are opposed, or at least are not that sympathetic to.
Stephanie, do you have a sense that if Premier Legault, who I think polls show is the most popular premier in the country today, if he had his druthers, how would he like to see the seat count emerge after next Monday the 20th election?
So at the onset of the election, Mr. Legault made no secret that he was hoping for a Conservative minority in Ottawa, with probably a strong Bloc presence, if only for the fact that the Bloc, since 2019, has turned itself into François Legault's megaphone in Ottawa, essentially. They're very much riding on the coattails of the CAQ, as Danielle just mentioned. However, if we were to ask Mr. Legault this question today, I'm not sure he would have the same answer, especially in light of the fact that we finally got the costing for the Conservative platform at the 11th hour last night before the French debate. And what we know now is that Quebec would lose out lots on the childcare front if the Conservatives were in power. The Liberal government has signed an agreement to transfer $6 billion for childcare, and obviously the Quebec government has pledged to spend it in a number of ways within the childcare program that already exists in Quebec, unlike in other provinces. And the Conservative platform, it is now clear, would bring in a lot less money to the provincial government. So it is no coincidence, I think, that Mr. Blanchet was attacking Mr. O'Toole both last week in the TVA debate and last night on that specific part of the Conservative platform.
Well, Danielle, one thing I think we've all noticed in English Canada is that none of the federal leaders seems particularly interested in taking on, for example, Bill 21, the no head coverings, barring of religious symbols and so on, if you want to work in the public service. Does that suggest that all of these leaders are so concerned about starting some kind of culture war between English and French Canada that they are essentially, they're just leaving that issue alone and no one's going near it?
Yes, I think that it's considered as a toxic issue in Quebec among Francophone voters to criticize Bill 21. And you know what happened to Justin Trudeau back in 2019 when François Legault criticized him for his position on Bill 21. That was actually really good for the Bloc. And I think if François Blanchet, is really aligned himself with François Legault, he started in 2019 and he has been done that ever since. And I think that people don't want to mess with François Legault. So I think because François Legault is defending Bill 21 and is basically told federal leaders, you should not get involved in that file, that the party leaders have obliged because François Legault is so popular in Quebec. So in the end, it's about François Legault and the fact that he is so popular that the party leaders are afraid that Legault could turn against them publicly in a strong way, which will actually hurt them in the polls.
You know, Stephanie, I remember many elections ago, somebody once told me, a candidate for the Liberals once told me, if Quebec separated, would anybody really notice? And I wonder whether you think that, Bill 21 is an example of the fact that French and English are maybe two solitudes today, more entrenched in their own camps, maybe more than ever before. I don't know. You tell me.
Well, if Quebec were to separate, I can tell you that 1 million francophones outside Quebec would definitely notice because it would probably mean some significant changes for the respective French in the rest of Canada. So, but to your question, I don't think we're at a point today where Quebec and Canadians are that far apart on several issues, despite the fact that there is a strong nationalist stance. Sovereignty today is actually quite an unpopular idea. It's quite striking to me that for the past two elections, the Bloc Québécois has made very little, if any, mention of sovereignty or of independence. It is an idea that seems like it's not on the radar anymore, and it's particularly unpopular among young Québécois populations. So I don't think we're at a breaking point by any stretch of the term here.
Okay, Daniel, let me ask the question to you this way. You work for a group called the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. So I want to ask you about what your understanding in 2021 of Canada is. Are we still a country seen by the majority of people as a country of two founding peoples?
Well, this narrative of two founding peoples is being challenged by Indigenous peoples, for example. And so I think there is a debate about that going on in this country. We didn't talk that much about Indigenous peoples last night. I hope that this will be different, of course, in the English language debate. I think that Stephanie is right. Of course, support for sovereignty in Quebec is quite low right now, especially among younger people. But there is still this idea of two solitudes. A lot of Quebecers don't know that much about what's happening in other parts of the country, like in Alberta, for example. When I live in Calgary, I had a journalist from La Presse who visited me, and she knew nothing about the National Energy Program, for example, which is a pretty big thing for people in Alberta. So I think, and people outside of Quebec, maybe it's not as much the case in Ontario because we are neighbors, but you know, when I live in Saskatchewan or Alberta, many people had never been to Quebec and had a pretty limited understanding of what the province is beyond things like Poutine and you know, René Lévesque and things like that. So I think it's a big country. It's a fragmented country in many ways. And what we do at our institute is to try to actually help people from different regions of the country understand what's happening in other provinces. And that's part of an important dialogue that we need to have.
Stephanie, last word to you on that. Are we still a country of two founding nations?
I think, despite the fact that the Conservatives have been playing this rhetoric since Aaron O'Toole has become leader, clearly in a way to try to seduce the Quebec nationalist vote, the idea of two founding peoples it's showing its age at this point. You know, it is quite important for a vast part of the Canadian electorate today to give Indigenous peoples a bigger space and to see within our institutions how we can bring them in, and also to see how our institutions need to adapt to Indigenous peoples' viewpoints. So I think two founding peoples is not really the way that we should think about our country in 2021.
Très intéressant. Stephanie Chouinard, Queen's University and RMC, Danielle Bellon, McGill's Institute for the Study of Canada. Un grand plaisir to have both of you here at TVO ce soir. Bonne chance.
Merci.
Merci.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, September 9th, 2021. Tomorrow, Green Party leader Annamie Paul joins us to make her pitch to voters. Also, as we approach the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, Nan Kiwanuka talks to filmmaker Dia Khan about her new documentary, Muslim in America, Legacy of Fear. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.